Let's look at a new problem. Suppose I wanted to print to the screen a square of asterisk characters. That is just 5 rows of 5 asterisks each, a square of 5 by 5 asterisks. How could I do that? Well, I could hard code it, that is, just type in a print statement where I print a row of 5 asterisks and then duplicate this print statement 5 times. I run this and it does exactly what I want. It's straightforward, but it's not very efficient or scalable, and it's definitely not generalizable. What if I wanted to print not a 5 by 5 square of asterisks, but an 8 by 8 square? Would I have to write a different program? Couldn't I instead come up with a more general way where I could put in a number, and that number would control how many asterisks got printed? It seems like a natural thing that we ought to be able to do with computers, and iteration ought to be a way to get us there. So let's start with the second part of this problem, which is printing out 5 rows. Well, the for statement ought to be able to do that. It can iterate, but it doesn't have any concept of iterating n times or 5 times. The for statement iterates over a list. So if we want the for statement to iterate 5 times, what we need to do is make a list that is 5 elements long. And so we can do that by making a list, such as rows. We'll make a variable called rows, and we'll just make a list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Remember, we said that a list can contain anything, just integers is fine. So now we can use that variable called rows, which is a list of 5 elements, and iterate over those rows and say, for row in rows, do the following. Print 1 line of asterisks. That ought to work. It'll do it 5 times, and for each time it runs, it will print this thing. We can run this, and we get exactly the same output. Perfect. It worked. Now, this code's a little bit cleaner, but we still have it hard-coded to generate 5 of these things. Suppose instead I wanted to be able to have a variable called numRows and set it to a different number, say 8, and I wanted to automatically print the number of rows that is stored in that variable numRows. Well, I couldn't use this solution because this solution has the list length fixed. It turns out there's a simple solution, which is to use a special built-in function called range in Python, where you can give it a single parameter, which is an integer. In this case, I'm going to give it numRows, and it will generate the list that is the numbers 1 through the parameter you specified. Let's just take a quick look at the terminal so we can see what that looks like. If we type in range of 8, it generates a list actually of 0 through 7, but it gives us 8 things. Right? Computers are nice and general, so we can give it range of 42, and it'll give us the numbers 0 through 41. All right, so now this will do exactly the same thing, but now it will be general to work for any number of rows. And if we run this, we will in fact get 8 rows. Excellent, we're making progress. Each row, though, is still a fixed row of 5 items. Instead, wouldn't it be nice if we could have a number that specifies the number of columns? So let's make a variable called numCols. In this case, let's just also set it to 8. We can similarly use range to make a list with numCols elements. And now what we want to do is something a little bit tricky. We want to replace this print statement with another for loop. So we're going to say for col and cols, we might start by thinking we could just print a single asterisk. So first of all, there's something tricky here, which is we have what's called a nested for loop. That is, the outside for loop for row and rows is going to get executed once for each row. And for each row, it's going to do the following thing. It's going to execute another for loop and say for each column cols, it's going to print a star. Well, when we run this, it's not going to do what we want. What we're going to get is a big long list of 1 star per row. And the reason is because the print statement automatically puts a return, a new line, at the end of each line. So to avoid that, what we need to do in this inside for loop is to build up a string where all the asterisks are on a single line and then print it. We can do that in the following way. For each row, we can define a new variable called line, which is an empty string. And then for each column, we can add on an additional asterisk by concatenating an asterisk onto the current line. Then when the line is finished being built up, we can print the line. Now when we run it, we get the right thing, an 8 by 8 square of asterisks. We can change these numbers independently. So for example, we could make a rectangle that has 40 columns and 5 rows and run that. And sure enough, our program does that. So we've actually generalized this to go beyond a square to print out an asterisks in the form of any rectangle you'd like. All right, here's a problem for you. Can you modify this to print a triangle? What would you have to do to make it so it printed a right triangle so the first row had 1 asterisk, the second row had 2 asterisks, and the nth row had n asterisks?